everyone to today's session of our NOW program educational webinars. Today's topic will be clinical trials, moderated by Rachel Garcia Fox and led by Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez Castro. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to the NOW team for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A feature throughout the session. At the end of the session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate a Q&A. If you have any other questions or would like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website, www.dana-farber.org/resource center, or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to Rachel to introduce our panelist.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here today. Welcome to a new Neuro-Oncology Wellness Education webinar. The Neuro-Oncology Wellness, or NOW program, is a new initiative from the Center for Neuro-Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, with a mission to educate patients and their caregivers about brain tumors, as well as provide resources to promote overall health and well-being. Thank you so much for joining us. We want you to be a part of this conversation by submitting your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll select a number of your questions for our guests to answer in the second half of the program. My name is Rachel Garcia Fox, and I serve as the program administrator for NOW. I will be your host for this series. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez Castro, who's joining us for a discussion on brain tumor clinical trials. Dr. Gonzalez Castro is an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and a physician scientist at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center of Neuro-Oncology, where, in addition to caring for brain tumor patients, he's active in basic and translational research, studying both glioblastoma and IDH mutant gliomas. Dr. Gonzalez Castro is also the founder and director of the Neuro-Oncology, or NOW program, wellness program. Dr. Gonzalez Castro, thank you for joining us. Many of the patients that see us at the Center for Neuro-Oncology are interested in clinical trials. So today we're going to go in a little bit more in depth what those are all about. Let's start with a basic question. What is a clinical trial?
Thank you. That's an important question. And I will just clarify for the audience attending today that our colleague and director, Dr. Patrick Nguyen, was hoping to be here today. Unfortunately, due to personal reasons, he cannot join us. So he'll be leading another webinar in the coming year, talking about some of the specific targeted therapies that he's helping develop for some of the tumors we treat here. But we decided to go ahead and provide an overview and a discussion on current clinical trials and the mechanics of clinical trials, and that's what we're meeting today. So going to the question, a clinical trial is essentially an experiment where we're trying to understand if a new therapy that has been developed based on experiments that were done in the lab using cells or using animal models and has shown promise to be effective against a particular tumor, then it needs to be studied in the context of a clinical trial to determine if this therapy is safe, if it's efficacious, and if it's effective. And those are steps that need to be addressed before the drug can then be made available to patients everywhere for treatment. So in a way, is the most important experiment that we do here at Dana-Farber, which is the experiment that allow us to bring new therapies for all our patients.
Great, thank you so much for that overview. Sounds like there are some different types of clinical trials, but the overall purpose is really to bring that science that maybe was done in the lab to potentially a drug in the clinic with patients. So
Exactly.
can we elaborate a little more on why there's a need for clinical trials, maybe specifically in neuro-oncology?
Well, we know that gliomas, which account for the majority of the tumors that we care for here at the Center for Neuro-Oncology, are tumors of the brain and the central nervous system that in the vast majority are infiltrating of the brain. They start in the brain, they're made out of the substance of the brain, and they infiltrate the brain, and they're very difficult to treat. Diffuse infiltrating gliomas over time shorten people's lives, and the treatments that we have available so far are known to be effective in trying to slow down tumor growth, but we do not have treatments now that can completely eradicate tumor from the brain. And that's why we feel a sense of urgency in trying to identify new treatments, be it, drugs or combinations of drugs with other therapies that will help our patients more, with the hope of extending the lives of our patients by many, many years.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's kind of an essential part of the type of care that we give here is that, there are these options of participating in investigation that may lead to the development of something, that helps with even better outcomes than we currently have. Can we talk a little bit about kind of when in somebody's brain cancer journey or treatment history, treatment experience, they might be eligible to enroll in a clinical trial?
Yes, and I'm going to circumscribe my discussion, Rachel, to glioma and to the aggressive gliomas, high-grade gliomas, glioblastoma, or high-grade IDH mutant glioma, because I think these are the ones that are of most interest to our patients. And in the arc of a patient's diagnosis and treatment, there are two main instances where patients can participate in a clinical trial. One is when they're first diagnosed, when they present after a seizure or a persisting headache, an MRI reveals a lesion in the brain that is then confirmed to be a tumor after surgery. And you meet with one of us here, and we discuss, next steps in terms of how to address this. And we will often, if not always, introduce the option of clinical trials. That's treatment at initial diagnosis with a clinical trial. And that's the number one recommendation of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. So for aggressive gliomas, if a clinical trial is available, it should be offered to a patient, and patients should strongly consider pursuing that. If a patient receives either a clinical trial or standard therapy, and after a period of time, either by changes on MRI or worsening symptoms in patients, we determine that the patient is no longer being served by the current treatment, then we also have another opportunity to discuss other treatments, including clinical trials. So this is an instance called recurrence or progression. And at this junction, we also discuss clinical trial options. So for patients with high-grade aggressive gliomas, we discuss clinical trials at the beginning, the newly diagnosed setting, or at the time of progression.
Great. So just to kind of recap, it's not like, in a period, let's say, of stable disease, you would seek out a clinical trial. It's typically going to be in this population that we're talking about right now, when you either have an initial diagnosis or at a period where there's a need for treatment.
Yes. I would add, though, that, for patients that have stable disease, if they're receiving an active treatment, we don't want to, stop that if the patient is getting a benefit out of that treatment. However, for patients receiving standard therapy, where we know that every patient that receives standard care therapy will go on to have progression, is not unreasonable to perhaps seek a consultation and learn about clinical trials and clinical trial options for the time when changes are seen on MRI or clinical changes are noted.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, that it can be useful to make a connection with a provider who offers clinical trials like our providers at the Center for Neuro-Oncology, in the case that in the future it may be, an opportunity for you to enroll or see if you're eligible. So let's go back to kind of the different categories of clinical trials you touched on a little bit at the beginning. Patients often hear about clinical trials being in different phases. So we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. What do these phases refer to?
So each clinical trial is trying to answer a specific question. And a phase 1 clinical trial, the question that is answering is one of safety. Is this drug or treatment one that is safe for patients to receive? And there, patients will be monitored for any kind of adverse events that they experience with this treatment. And if these are severe enough, the treatment is stopped, and that therapy will be unlikely to proceed to further testing. If a drug or a treatment is proven to be safe, then the next stage is to look into the question of efficacy. Is the drug doing anything to address the specific tumor that we're treating here? And that's often done by looking at a specific biomarker, either an imaging biomarker or doing some other form of analysis to try to distinguish if the drug is having an effect on the tumor itself. And then if we confirm that the drug is having an effect on the tumor in humans, we move on to a phase 3 study where we're trying to compare the standard treatment to this new treatment and trying to show that not only is efficacious, not only it acts on the tumor, but it acts to an extent that is greater than that seen with a standard therapy. And the phase 3 clinical trials are then the ones that are required by the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, for trying to make a drug or a treatment approved for patients in general. So that's an important step. Phase 1 studies are usually smaller, enrolling usually in the order of 15 to 20 to a couple dozen patients. Phase 2 trials are larger, and then phase 3 trials usually go on to enroll sometimes hundreds of patients to try to demonstrate a benefit from the new therapy.
Great, thank you for that overview. And just to elaborate maybe a little bit on the different phases and the goals, the questions that are attempted to be answered. Maybe if anybody's in the audience has been on a clinical trial, you may have like a blood sample that is drawn, or for example, in a phase 1 trial, they're going to be looking at that to help answer that question. So there often are assessments, right, Dr. Gonzalez Castro, that go along with the different clinical trials to help meet the goal of answering the question.
Exactly. We're trying to collect information in multiple respects in terms to show that the drug is safe and efficacious and effective. And many questionnaires are collected from patients, getting them to answer questions regarding symptoms. Labs are routinely drawn at clinical trial visits and before the initiation of clinical trials, and imaging is obtained regularly as well. I would also say that despite the fact that a phase 1 study is looking at safety as the primary endpoint, it doesn't mean that a patient might not benefit in terms of an extension in terms of their overall survival. And although in a phase 1 study, safety is the primary endpoint, those patients are followed over time. And, if there's a signal of response in terms of efficacy, that's also reported. Oftentimes patients say, well, I'm interested in a clinical trial, but I would like to participate in a phase 3 clinical trial. And the reality is that there are not too many phase 3 clinical trials out there for aggressive gliomas because the therapies have not matured enough to be at that stage. So patients should consider if a clinical trial is available to enroll in a phase 1 study, because that drug that is now being evaluated in terms of safety might also provide a benefit in terms of efficacy long term, and patients can benefit from that right now. As an example of that, a novel therapy for IDH mutant gliomas involving IDH inhibitors. Studies on that began many years ago as phase 1 studies. And, at that time, patients, didn't know if they were going to get a benefit in terms of, extending their survival or extending the stability of their imaging. And now we know, after recent completion of a very large phase 3 study, that, that drug is effective and provides a benefit. So the patient that participated in the phase 1 study and might still be getting the drug was benefiting from day one. So I wanted to clarify that too.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I actually met a patient, recently that is on a phase 1 trial of that. I believe the drug that you're talking about, the phase 3 trial has gone on to happen, but you're right. Sometimes they will continue to get it if it's, proving efficacious and effective. So, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit more about terminology. I think it'd be helpful to clarify some of the words that are used to describe different trials. So sometimes we hear the words randomization. Another one is blinding. We have control arms. I'm wondering if we can go over those concepts for our audience.
Yes. Thank you, Rachel, for asking that important question. So when we do a clinical trial, which I repeat, as I said at the beginning, is an experiment to try to determine if this drug provides a benefit, we want to make sure that we don't bias that experiment in any way. We try to do it in a fair way, in a scientific way. And with that purpose, since every patient is different, has a different body and a different, medical history that predates their cancer diagnosis, it's very hard to control for every single element that makes a patient different. To try to address for the variability and diversity that is in any patient population, we bring patients into a study and we randomly assign to one of the many groups that are being evaluated in a study. That process of randomization is a statistical mechanism to take out the effect of the variability that could bias the results of the study. Another effect that we want to try to remove is the effect that is induced by knowing what therapies patients are receiving, both on behalf of the patient and on behalf of the clinician or the investigator. Because if you are somehow invested in developing a particular therapy and you know that you're giving that therapy to patients, there might be an effect in making the patients that receive that therapy or try to provide additional care that might lead to a benefit that is not really driven by the therapy itself. And this is why blinding is done. There is single blinding where patients do not know what therapy they're receiving. And there's double blinding where neither the patient nor the investigator knows what therapy is being given. And again, the incorporation of blinding brings a study to a different level in terms of adhering to best practices in terms of how a study is conducted. And the other question that you asked me, it was about control arms.
Correct.
And many drugs, when they're being studied, particularly for conditions where we don't know if given no drug would be as good as given a given drug, are controlled with a sugar pill or a placebo. We do not do that in neuro-oncology. We do not let patients go without treatment. And it's very important for patients to understand that they won't be enrolled in a study where someone gets a drug and they get nothing. What is done in neuro-oncology is to use standard of care therapies as the control arm. So you either in a study that is controlled, the standard care will be offered as the control, and in that study the patient will either get the new therapy or they will get the control, which is the standard therapy. And it's important to note that this is a reasonable control because we do not know a priori before the study if the new drug will be more effective than the standard therapy, which we know provides a benefit because it's been established already with other clinical trials. So if a study has a control arm that is the standard therapy, and it is still reasonable to be considered for that study, even if you're randomized or assigned to the control arm, because to be fair, and this is to be discussed with every patient during the process of consenting for a study, we do not know upfront if the drug that we're studying will give you a bigger benefit than the one that you would get from standard therapy.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, it goes back to also your point about the guidelines for treating these higher grade gliomas, which are really that a phase 1 clinical trial is kind of the best option. Is that what you said earlier?
No, what I was alluding there is that patients shouldn't shy away from enrolling in a phase 1 study, thinking that this is a therapy that is very new, because every therapy that at some point was shown to be effective on a phase 3 trial at some point had a phase 1 trial behind it. So you should discuss with your doctor about the rationale for the study. Why is it that we're doing it? Your doctor should be able to tell you a little bit about the science that went into the development of this specific drug, and based on that, you should make a decision in consultation with your physician as to if you want to participate or not. But although we would like to have all our clinical trials be phase 3, the reality is that most of them are phase 1 or phase 2 studies, and those studies add value not only from a scientific standpoint, but patients can directly benefit from those therapies if proven to be effective.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. And what are the therapeutic modalities that are currently being evaluated in Dana-Farber trials?
So we cover the whole spectrum of therapeutic modalities in cancer. So we offer studies that are looking at targeted therapies. These are molecules that are designed to address a specific change that is present in cancer cells that drive their growth and proliferation. So the idea of using these molecules is to try to stop cancer cells from growing and proliferating, and oftentimes lead to cell death to try to control their growth. In addition, we're looking at different ways of trying to activate and re-engage the immune system to try to clear cancer cells. Our immune system that protects us from infections and viruses, so common this time of the year, also has a role in trying to keep cancer at bay. Naturally, cells of their immune system are surveilling the body and trying to identify abnormal cells that are often clear. So we might all develop small cancers throughout our life that we never learn about because our immune system is clearing them out. However, when a tumor forms, it indicates that the immune system was not effective in trying to control that. And this happens for a number of reasons. But the immune system can be reactivated and enabled to try to control the tumor. And the best example of this is the use of therapies called immune checkpoint inhibitors that have proven to be very effective in a number of cancers, including lung cancer and melanoma. And these are therapies that we often, give to some of our patients with brain metastases here at the Center for Neuro-Oncology. These therapies, however, have not been found to be effective in gliomas yet. There have been several studies, and they have not shown a benefit. This was discussed to some extent in our earlier conversation with Dr. David Reardon. However, we're looking to combine these therapies with other immunotherapies and other targeted therapies to see if we can get a benefit. There are other forms of immunotherapy, for example, the use of cells that have been modified to identify cancer cells and clear them out, the so-called chimeric antigen receptor T cells, or CAR T cell therapies, which we're currently studying in our patients with primary CNS lymphoma. And there's also interesting studying those CAR T cell therapies in gliomas. Another form of immunotherapy is the use of viruses that are known to infect the brain, and taking advantage of that property, these viruses can be modified to target only cancer cells in the brain and not normal brain cells, by which the virus itself can lead to death of the cell. They're so-called oncolytic viruses, but at the same time can produce an immune response that can help clear viruses. And this is currently being studied in a project that is a collaboration between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Dana-Farber, and that's just another modality. In addition, we're combining targeted therapies and immunotherapies with standard forms of treatment, such as standard chemotherapy and radiation therapy. These are other treatment modalities that sometimes are included in clinical trials in combinations with a novel therapy.
Very interesting. Thank you for giving us that overview and also some of the more details about the particular modalities. It sounds like, even if one drug doesn't work on its own, like you mentioned, immunotherapy in gliomas, for example, it may have potential to work in combination with another modality. It's very interesting. Why don't we talk a little bit about surgery? So we kind of just spoke on systemic therapies. Is that correct? Would you call most of those are systemic therapies, with radiation, of course, being in its own category? But how about surgery? What is a surgical trial? Can you explain a little bit?
Yes. So surgery is the first step in the diagnosis and treatment of a patient with glioma, because first, it helps establish a diagnosis, obtain tissue to look under the microscope and test in the lab to specifically name that tumor and know how to best treat it. But then removal of all that can be removed of the tumor can also help patients long-term. So it's a very important treatment that is offered to our patients in collaboration with our colleagues from the neurosurgery department. However, patients might encounter that they are being asked to participate in a surgical trial or surgical window of opportunity trial. And what this means is that we are trying to study the effect of the new therapy in the tumor by looking at the tumor cells themselves. And we do this by giving a therapy before patients need to go for surgery. The need for surgery is established separate from the clinical trial. Someone has a brain lesion that looks like a glioma and perhaps was just biopsied, a small piece was removed, the diagnosis was confirmed, but that patient needs additional surgery. So then at that time, a patient could enroll in a clinical trial that treats them with a treatment for 1 or 2 weeks. And then the patient goes for surgery, the tumor is removed and is studied in the lab, and then patients continue treatment. This can happen also at the time of disease progression or a recurrence. This is when changes are seen on the MRI that indicate the tumor is growing, or when patients are having more symptoms, and that's thought to represent growth of the tumor that sometimes cannot be clearly seen on MRI. At that time, if a surgery would be of benefit to the patient, patients can participate in a surgical window opportunity study where they would get a therapy, they would go to surgery, the tumor would be removed, and then they would continue with the therapy. So I explain to my patients that those studies have a double benefit. One is that they're exposing patients to a novel therapy. And second is that they are also getting the benefit of the surgery that oftentimes, provides additional clinical benefit. These are also the best studies that we can do in terms of trying to understand how these therapies work on the tumor. So I think it's important that there are more surgical studies being offered, and I think these are the studies that will really show us the way in terms of identifying the best therapies to treat these tumors.
Very exciting stuff. Thank you for telling us a little bit more about surgical trials. So I wanted to go back to randomization. So we talked about randomization earlier. That's kind of when you would be decided, which arm, let's say, or which treatment you're going to get on a certain trial. Do patients learn if they're going to receive the trial drug or standard of care? We talked a little bit about placebo. What happens there?
Yeah, so patients learn often by the dynamics of the treatment plan. You could know right away, if the alternative therapy was an injectable therapy, and you're assigned to receive a pill, then you're obviously not getting the studied therapy, you're getting the standard therapy. But in a number of trials, patients are unblinded sometimes. So it's revealed what therapy they're receiving, and patients can know. Another way that sometimes patients realize, what kind of treatment they're receiving is by side effects. Side effects will be discussed up front. These are so-called adverse events that patients experience, and by recognizing some of the adverse events, if you were to experience any, you would also know what therapy you're receiving. I would also mention that even in randomized blind trials, if at some point there is discovery that the therapy is effective, the trial is unblinded and the therapy is offered to all participants. And this is what happened with the Indigo study that I alluded to earlier, studying an IDH inhibitor in IDH mutant gliomas. After a certain period of time, it was recognized by looking at the response in both the placebo arm and the IDH inhibitor arm, that the IDH inhibitor was effective, and then everyone went on to receive the therapy. So this is something that happens.
Great, that's wonderful to know. So if you are on a standard of care arm and the study drug is found to be effective, you may actually move on to the study drug arm later on in the experience of the trial. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about how the discussion goes with patients. Sometimes when we're talking about clinical trials with patients, they really want to know what trials are promising right now. Is this information available to you as a physician in advance of the publication of trial results?
Thank you. Yes, I alluded to this earlier, and I was in my own clinic this morning, and I had this discussion with a couple of different patients. Patients want to ask, doctor, what are the promising studies? What are the ones that are showing a good response? And the reality is that we do not know a priori, what are the studies that, are most promising. We might be excited based on the preclinical data, studies that we might have seen before, where like cells or mice were treated with these therapies, and there seemed to be an interesting signal. But while we're conducting the study, we do not know what studies are best. And I know that this is incredibly frustrating for patients, but it is just the way that we can study these different drugs and determine objectively that they're effective. When we are enrolling patients in study, oftentimes we don't see all the data that is available. And even if we are the principal investigator for a study, it is by design that the person that is designing the study does not analyze the data to remove any possibility of bias. So even if it's my own study that I'm enrolling a patient in, I cannot tell the patient, how, things are going so far based on the patients that we have enrolled. And I know that this is difficult to understand, but it is just the way that we can objectively study these therapies and eventually offer the safest and most effective therapies to our patients.
Okay, so it sounds like you may discuss preclinical data, or that may be something you're considering when you're determining which trials to discuss with an individual patient. I'm wondering, is there anything else that you would consider? If you don't know the data, let's say, what are you considering when you're deciding what would be appropriate or what to discuss with a patient?
Yeah, so the foundation of the discussion is the fact that we, as a community, the neuro-oncology community, all agree that clinical trials are the best first option at initial diagnosis and at disease progression. With that in mind, we can try to help our patients make that decision based on the preclinical data and discussing that preclinical data in an unbiased way. And then there are other elements to be considered, and these are patient specific. Patients that might have other conditions separate from the tumor, and the therapy that is being studied might worsen any of those conditions. We might decide that that might not be the best study for this particular patient. Or if there are logistic considerations, many studies require very frequent visits. Those visits need to happen at the study center, being Dana-Farber or another academic medical center. So for many patients, that implies a lot of traveling back and forth, and it's just not feasible for them to participate. So that's taken into consideration as well. So neuro-oncologists, know their patients, and patients know themselves. And this is a joint decision that is based on, the overall recommendation for clinical trials, the promise of whatever therapy is being studied, and then the reality of the patient and his or her circumstances.
Thank you. That's a really nice way of putting it. It is the partnership between the physician and the patient, figuring out what's best for them. Sounds like you mentioned eligibility criteria is what we would call some of the points that you made earlier. In eligibility criteria, sometimes we'll see exclusionary criteria. Sometimes that includes prior treatments, right? Can we talk a little bit more about that? Like if a patient has recently had radiation and or chemotherapy, do they need to wait? Would that ever, prohibit them from entering the trial? Are there drugs like that?
Yes, so we try to separate prior therapies from the new therapy studied in the clinical trial for two main reasons. One is we want to make sure that whatever benefit we see from the new therapy is due to the new therapy and not due to a prior therapy. So there's usually a waiting period, oftentimes is at least 4 weeks for radiation and other forms of therapy like temozolomide before patients can enroll and start the new therapy. And then the other important reason is that we want to make sure that patients don't have any side effects from combining, the new therapy with a recent therapy they have received. So it doesn't preclude, having prior therapies doesn't preclude, for a whole family of clinical trials, those offer at progression or recurrence, patients by definition have had other therapies before. But, there are some considerations in terms of eligibility. Some treatments sometimes prevent patients from enrolling. For example, if a patient has been treated with immunotherapy and has not had a response, then another immunotherapy trial might exclude patients that have previously been treated with immunotherapy.
So it's going to be very specific to the trial and also to the previous treatment. So it's something to bring up that your physician would likely bring up if you're interested in a clinical trial. It would be involved in the discussion. How much is known with regards to side effects of trial medications?
Yeah. So this depends on the phase of the trial. So for a phase 1 trial, what we know about side effects is based on preclinical data, so studies on animals. For a phase 2 trial, we have the phase 1 trial that has told us, what side effects to expect. It doesn't mean that we don't discover new side effects sometimes as we enroll more patients. And then in a phase 3 trial, again, there's the phase 1 and the phase 2 trial that have provided information in terms of side effects. Oftentimes, major side effects can be identified in preclinical studies using animals. But the reality is that some things are not seen, and that's why the monitoring is very closely done to make sure that if there's any new symptom or any new change with a patient, we identify that as quickly as we can.
Great. Okay. What if somebody is experiencing a lot of side effects? Can they unenroll from a trial?
Yeah. Patients enroll in clinical trials voluntarily, and they can withdraw their consent at any point. Even if you sign consent to participate after being seen in clinic, and then you go home and talk to your husband or talk to your wife, and you realize that this is not something that you want to participate in, you just call and you're taken of the trial, and there shouldn't be any effect to you. The relationship with your clinicians should be the same, and you should continue to receive the best possible treatment that you're willing to engage with. So never hesitate if you at any point are concerned and don't want to participate anymore, to bring it up with your neuro-oncologist or with your clinical team and say, I want to get off the trial, and you shouldn't think that that's going to affect the relationship in any way. It shouldn't.
Thank you for emphasizing that, Dr. Gonzalez-Castro. It's a really important point that it's all voluntary. It's an important reminder for our patients, definitely. In the case that, you're enrolled in a trial, let's say you've started treatment and then you either decide, you don't want to do it anymore, and you decide to stop the trial, or let's say, you have side effects and you need to come off. Are there any additional visits that are required specifically for that type of patient in that scenario?
Sometimes there's usually a closing visit when patients, are coming off the study. Study drugs are collected if patients had them at home. Study diaries are collected. Exit questionnaires are done. A last round of labs are often obtained. These are often, done in the context of a standard clinical visit. So, it doesn't overburden patients in particular, but, as with anything, we want to make sure that everything is documented appropriately, so we can, report any of the findings in a clear way.
Great. Okay. So in general, would you say that trial patients need to complete more visits than somebody, let's say, on standard of care who's not on a clinical trial?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement, particularly not necessarily at the end of the study or when they come off the study, but throughout the study, we want to collect additional information, so additional labs and additional questions that we would like our patients to answer. So oftentimes there are additional visits. Sometimes because of the way the therapy is designed, patients might need to come very often. And by that, I mean sometimes a couple of times within a given week or every week for several weeks to receive the therapy as it is designed to be given. So that's a reality. And this also is discussed at the time of consenting for the study, so patients are aware of what the trial entails, and they can decide if that's something they want to participate in.
Okay, great. I'm wondering if we can just touch a little bit on some of the practical considerations patients should be aware of when they're considering clinical trials, and then we'll go to some audience questions. Are there any practical considerations that patients should be aware of when it comes to clinical trials?
Well, I think that the main thing is to be aware of the logistics of the trial, of how the trial is conducted, what are the visits, how they need to take whatever therapies they're taking, if they're taking them at home, how they need to document, the administration of those therapies in their drug diaries, how they need to communicate with the study team if something is off. So it's very important for patients to be aware of all those things. One practical consideration that comes up also is the issue of cost. Patients often ask, is there additional cost because of this? And the answer is no. Clinical trials, the funding for clinical trials, which is, a very expensive undertaking, is supported through, many of the institutions and companies that are trying to develop these therapies, in addition to, funding from other agencies. And many of the tests and assessments that are done within the trial are the same as those that are done routinely in clinical care. So in that setting, many of these costs, like the cost of imaging or some of the blood tests, are charged directly to the patient's insurance in the same way that they would be charged if they were receiving a standard therapy.
That's very helpful to know. Thank you for emphasizing that. I think, we're going to shift to some audience questions now, Dr. Gonzalez-Castro. If there's
Sure.
anything, though, that you think you want to bring up, just in addition to what we already spoke about, please feel free. And we have a... Yeah,
go ahead.
ahead.
We can answer questions now.
Okay. So one question is, are the clinical trials only available at Dana-Farber? If we have a trial at Dana-Farber, is that the only place that you can get, enroll in that clinical trial?
No, clinical trials are available at many large academic centers. Here at the Center of Neuro-Oncology, we have a longstanding commitment to clinical trials, and we work very hard to make many clinical trials available to our patients. But there are other institutions that offer clinical trials as well, and oftentimes they will offer different clinical trials. So a good resource for patients is a website that is maintained by the government called clinicaltrials.gov, and they can go online, and on the main screen, they can type their diagnosis and search for clinical trials. And there they would get a good amount of information in terms of not only the name of the clinical trial, the phase of the clinical trial, the therapy being studied, the centers that are offering this study. And then you would read, Dana-Farber Cancer Center, Brigham and Women's Hospital, or other centers here in Boston or elsewhere. And then, with that information, you can reach out to us or to any other center and, arrange for a consultation to participate in a clinical trial or discuss eligibility. And this is something that happens every day to us. We get calls from many patients from New England and other parts of the country, and, even international patients that reach out to discuss clinical trial options. And then the other thing that is related to that is that sometimes clinical trials are based out of an institution, but some components of it can be received locally. So, for example, some trials involve radiation. And if you live, far away from Boston, some trials allow you to receive radiation locally and still participate in the trial. Some trials require you to receive it at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, so you have to come for regular visits here, but some trials allow it for you to receive that therapy locally.
That's a great point to bring up, and definitely something to bring up with your physician. If you're talking about a clinical trial, find out, what the options are, if there is any flexibility on the location to make it most convenient for you and your family whenever possible. We have a question about sounds like a challenging situation where somebody is on a clinical trial and the trial has the sponsor, right? The pharmaceutical company has determined that there is no more drug for the trial to continue. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for a patient in this scenario. I know it's a hard one.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. Oftentimes, trials are stopped when overall in the aggregate, it doesn't seem that the drug is working. However, it always happens that there's a subset of patients that have had a response to that therapy and are still benefiting from that therapy. So although the trial is closed, those patients can, for the most part, still receive the therapy from the company. And companies make a commitment to make drug available to patients to continue on therapy if they are experiencing a benefit. So and all this is trial specific and compound specific. So I would encourage this patient to discuss with their neuro-oncologist what options are for continuation if the company is no longer offering the drug. Sometimes it can be requested through a mechanism called compassionate use. Sometimes other alternatives, maybe other drugs that have a similar mechanism of action, can be offered to the patient. But again, it's relatively a rare instance that patients, if they're still benefiting from the drug, will not be able to continue it.
Yeah, it sounds like a very challenging situation. And I think that's great advice to, talk to your physician about options. Compassionate use is a kind of term that we use. So that is something definitely to consider, see if it's an option. It sounds like in this scenario, Dr. Gonzalez-Castro, there's a limited amount of funding. That's the reason for the drug not being available. So it's definitely a conversation to have with your provider when moving forward. We have a couple of questions that are specific to trials. So this might be a bit of a pop quiz for you, Dr. Gonzalez-Castro. And if you don't know the answers to these, we can send out the information maybe after the webinar. But SURVAX is a trial that we have some people in the audience wondering about the phase of the trial specifically. Do you happen to know offhand? Again, pop quiz. So
yes,
totally okay.
So I think this question is alluding to a study that we have here, is DFCI 21397, studying the combination of a drug, standard therapy, temozolomide, with a cancer vaccine. This is a vaccine that is designed just like many vaccines are designed, for example, against infections, that contains a small piece of protein that is present in tumor cells, and is shown to the immune system with the hope that the immune system will create an immune response against that, and that response will be targeted to the tumor cells in the brain. And in this particular case, is a protein called survivin that helps tumor cells survive, and this is the SURVAX vaccine. I believe that's a phase 2 study that is being conducted, and it's available. It's one of the studies that is available here at Dana-Farber.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a question too about that study and whether it's a potential breakthrough. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about what phase 2 means. If it is a phase 2 study, what does that tell us about the drug?
Essentially, as we discussed earlier, we're looking at efficacy. Is this study, is this drug, having the intended goal, in this case, generating an immune response that is, targeted against the cancer cells. And, we know that since it's a phase 2, this was well tolerated in a phase 1 study. And now we're just trying to see if patients are responding to that.
Great.
In this particular study, there are specific assessments that we don't need to get into in terms of how they're ascertaining that.
Right, absolutely. So we're probably going to leave it there for the questions. I want to remind the audience, if you have specific questions about a treatment that you're on or something involved in your care, please do bring your questions to your care team. And I'm wondering, Dr. Gonzalez Castro, if we can just touch quickly on some of the trials that have helped improve treatment. Maybe we can end on that positive note. To neuro-oncology patients specifically, are there any trials that you want to mention today?
You know, there are not many, and some of the ones that have established the current standard of care date back to many years to many almost a couple of decades. But I would highlight the Indigo study that was published earlier this year using an IDH inhibitor, an inhibitor of the mutant isocitrate dehydrogenase enzyme that is present in a subset of gliomas that is most commonly diagnosed in younger patients. And that study, patients receiving this drug had stability of their MRI scans for much longer than patients that did not receive it, those patients that receive the placebo arm. And those patients went longer until they needed to get additional therapy. So I think that's a great advance. This drug that was studied in this trial is called vorasidenib and will likely become part of the standard treatment for low-grade IDH mutant gliomas in the coming year. So that's an exciting development that we have had in the past year. Dr. Patrick Wen was very much involved with the design of that study, along with colleagues from other institutions. So we celebrate that advance that we've had in the last year.
It is very exciting indeed. And for those who are interested in learning a bit more about IDH mutant gliomas, if you were not at our previous Now webinar on IDH mutant gliomas, we do send out an email that has the recordings at the bottom. So if you received an email for this webinar today and you are interested in watching the IDH mutant glioma webinar, you can scroll down and you will see the video for that, as well as other videos for our previous webinars. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Castro, for such a comprehensive discussion. I'm wondering, do you have any take-home points that you'd like to leave with our audience?
First, I would like to say that we thank you to all of you that have participated in clinical trials at Dana-Farber or elsewhere. You have helped advance the care of cancer patients and brain tumor patients. And it's very brave and often very selfless from patients to do this. I also want to say that if you're thinking about a clinical trial, to discuss this with your oncologist and really give some serious thought to this option. Hopefully this program has helped you understand some of the logistics about clinical trials and has helped demystify some of the language around it. We do think that is the best way to move forward for patients with high-grade aggressive glioma, such as glioblastoma or grade 3 or 4 IDH mutant glioma. So explore those possibilities if they're available to you. And we thank you for joining us for all the programs of the Neuro-Oncology Wellness Series this year. And we look forward to seeing you next year with some additional programming.
I second that. Thank you everyone so much for joining. And again, thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Castro, for this great webinar today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you both for joining us today. That was a great, fantastic program. I know that I learned a lot. So thank you both for taking the time to join us. As we mentioned earlier, this session was recorded and it will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist as well. So please keep an eye out for that and all of our future Now webinars to come. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Nick Gonzalez Castro and Rachel, and everyone have a great day.